So welcome to today's seminar. Today's speaker is Starý, who will be talking about unfriendly partitions.
Okay, so hello. First of all, are we doing this in English or? Yeah, that's a good thing because I don't need to translate unfriendly partitions. So it really be unfriendly partitions. So it's mostly graph theory, but very much sprinkled with set theory and infinite combinatorics. I will try to skip as much of the heavy set theoretic machinery to keep it elementary. That is not to say trivial, but elementary in the sense that it will be just nodes and vertices and edges and no the uniform ultrafilters and stuff like that because we got 40 minutes. Okay, so let me start with the definition, obviously. So let's say that a partition of a graph, all graphs will be undirected graphs. So a partition of some graph, let's say G with vertices V and edges E, is unfriendly if every node or every vertex, every V in V has at least as many neighbors or friends, neighbors in the other part of the partition. The other, meaning the partition where he is not, as in his own. So in the a nice illustration of that my daughter came up with is that your school trip is split into two buses, but you've got more friends in the other bus. And that happened not just to you, that happened to everyone. That's unfriendly. So that's an unfriendly partition. So the question, of course, is existence. Does every graph have an unfriendly partition? The first trivial case is the finite case, obviously, and every finite graph does have an unfriendly partition, and you know it already. Well, let's call it a theorem, but it's obvious. Every finite graph has, I'll be probably writing here like unfriendly partition UNP. What is the unfriendly partition? The maximal cut. The proof. We even have algorithms to find maximal cut, meaning cut the maximal number of edges you can. If the graph is finite, there's finitely many partitions altogether. So pick one of those partitions that cut the maximal number of edges, and that has to be unfriendly. Because if not, take the lucky guy who's got more friends in his part and move him to the other bus, and that will cut more edges than the maximal number, which is impossible. So every finite graph has an unfriendly partition. Now the next thing to prove, obviously, is to use the compactness compactness argument to make it more locally finite graph. So every locally finite, meaning all vertices are of finite degree. So the graph can be infinite, but everyone only has finitely many neighbors. So such a graph has an unfriendly partition. Now, first stop that I'm going to make, is everyone familiar with these compactness arguments? The compactness theorem, everyone knows what the compactness theorem is.
I do, but I would be surprised to see how this is used here.
Okay, great. So let's do the compactness argument. The proof is by compactness. So I'm gonna, first of all, let me recall the compactness theorem that says if a theory is satisfiable, that's if and only if every finite part is satisfiable. So what is the theory? So give me the graph. So vertices, edges, be locally finite. And first of all, I'm going to introduce the language in which the theory will be formulated. I'm going to describe a first order theory that will basically say what I want, namely there is an unfriendly partition. So the language for that theory is obviously two unary predicates for the two parts of the partition. So two unary predicates let's say R of A, R of B, and a constant, let's call it C of V for every vertex in the graph. So the language is infinite. The language is as infinite as the graph. And this is the theory in that language. The axioms are these. The first axiom is these two do form a partition, namely Ra of x is if and only if not Rb of x. So whatever you do beside that, these two subsets will form a partition of the graph. And for every node, I will put into the theory an axiom that says this guy has more neighbors in the other part than his home. I need a bit of notation for that. So for every node of the graph, do you have a favorite do you have a favorite notation for the neighbors? Let's say neighbors of V in the graph. V is neighbors, and let's say O of x consists of those subsets of V of its neighbors having at least half of the neighbors. So take the big subsets of neighbors, at least half, which makes perfect sense. It's a locally finite graph, so this is a number. So to say at least half makes perfect sense. Okay, and put into this theory P, let's say this is the axiom for the partition, and put this one.
So S will have S will be the subset of vertices that have at least half.
No, OV is a system of all such subsets.
Oh, all right. So that's
So what's O of V is those.
Sorry, yeah.
That's it. So the formula that says what I want is this: if the guy V happens to end up in the A part of the partition, then for at least one finite subset in this system, all of those guys in that subset will end up in the other part of the partition. Let's be pedantic for a moment. This is perfectly okay. This is a formula. The graph is locally finite, so this whole system is finite, and this is a finite disjunction over finitely many big subsets. And all of those subsets is finite. That's finitely many neighbors of this guy V. So this is perfectly okay syntactically. That's a formula in this language. And of course, the other way around. So if this guy happens to end up in the B part, then for at least some subset, some big subset, all of those guys in that subset end up in part A. So that's the theory. Please note that this is not three axioms. That's three types of axioms. The theory is as infinite as the graph. Now, I claim, of course, towards compactness that this is finitely satisfiable. So every finite part, let's say T prime of T, has a model. What is the model of every finite fragment of this theory? Well, take the finite subgraph, on those finitely many nodes, on those, let's say B in V, for which the constant, the corresponding C of V is mentioned in the finite fragment. The T prime is a finite fragment of this theory. It only talks about finitely many of these constants. We'll take the finitely many nodes. These are names for the nodes. That's a finite subgraph. Finite graph does have an unfriendly partition. We'll interpret these two symbols and these symbols in the obvious way, and that's a model for this theory. That's it. That's just finiteness. That's just finiteness. So every finite fragment does have a model. So compactness, of course, this is the big step. T has a model. This whole theory can be satisfied in one graph. Okay, so look at that model. Give me that model. So let this be a model of this theory. And that gives me the unfriendly partition of the original graph, because put B into A if in this model C of B happens to satisfy R of A, however they did that when God created that model. And well, and V in B otherwise, which is exactly the other case. So that's the part, obviously that's a partition, that's what this axiom says. And it is unfriendly, that's what these formulas say. If you end up in the A part, you've got at least half of your friends are in the other part. So that's it. This brings you from the locally finite to the infinite, which is locally finite is enough. The graph doesn't need to be finite. Okay, so that's the first two cases, finite and by compactness, locally finite. The grand question is, of course, whether all graphs have unfriendly partitions, and the answer is no. And the counterexamples are huge. I mean, huge. So, one more before we leave this easy part. This can be made better. Here, every node had only finitely many neighbors. If there's finitely many exceptions, namely finitely many nodes which have infinite degree, that's still okay. That can be still done. If G is locally finite, except finitely many vertices, so there's 16 bad guys, you can still do it. Then G has an unfriendly partition. Let's say I should give the credit. That's Milner in what, 88, 87, Milner and Sikri in 88. So these are the easy cases, locally finite or almost locally finite. The question, of course, they attributed to someone in the 30s already, or I forgot the name. But the question is, does every graph have an unfriendly partition? The answer, the counterexample that kills it, you can guess who? Shelah in 1989. The answer is no. And let me state the theory. First, there is a graph. There is a graph. Let me add that it is of size continuum plus omega. If you are not familiar with infinite cardinalities, don't be scared. This means the next limit cardinal after the size of the continuum. I mean, huge. If you don't understand these, just huge. Which does not. Sorry?
It can be almost anything you want.
Yeah. Actually, that will be the last part of the talk. How big does it need to be? That's from last week, actually. Which does not have an unfriendly partition, but Shelah being Shelah, every graph does have an unfriendly, take a guess, 3 partition. So far, partition meant partition into 2 pieces. Well, there's always partition into 3 pieces, such that everyone has more friends in the other 2 parts than in his own. Don't get fooled, that's not a strengthening. Define this, that's a weakening. Of course, the idea is to lump 2 of these 3 together, but then the guys will gain new friends and it will break the 2 partitions. It's not that easy. Okay, so the question now, like step back from that, the new question is, does every countable graph have an unfriendly partition? And besides these three theorems that I say here, almost nothing is known. I will show two more. Namely, if all of the vertices are of infinite degree, then you can do it by a zigzag method, which I can either skip if you're familiar with that, or just prove it because it's easy. And if there's no race, meaning infinite paths, and if there is no infinite clique or a subdivision of an infinite clique, and that's it. That's all that people know. The question is widely open for like decades. So let me do these two. The other extreme to that, if the graph, to this. So from now on, the graphs are countable, because if you're uncountable, it can already break. The question is, of course, how much uncountable does it have to be? So from now on, the graphs are countable. Okay, so theorem, what's the reference? Oh yeah, Rayless. Okay. Well, this is probably folklore, right? Yeah, of course, because it's okay. If let G be countable, and let every vertex be of infinite degree, meaning countable, of course. Then there is an unfriendly partition. Then there is an unfriendly partition. The proof is not easy. It is not hard. It's a zigzag method. I will go inductively through the nodes. I will just assume the nodes are the natural numbers. It doesn't matter what the nodes themselves are. And I will just make sure I put enough infinitely many guys there and infinitely many guys there for everyone. So let's say, put 0 into A, and put the first, I'll put a fresh, I will say fresh, meaning not consumed yet in this induction. Put a fresh, I'll put the first neighbor of 0 into B, right? So far, okay. And having, let's say, A0, which is this A, this is A0, B0. And having A0, B0 up to some AN and BN, put a fresh neighbor of every, look at all the B guys so far. So every B in all the BIs up to here, and put a neighbor of each of them not consumed yet into A. That's perfectly doable because everyone has infinitely many neighbors and finitely many have been consumed so far. And do the same thing. That's the zig, and the zag is do the same thing for the other guys. So put a fresh, plus an extra one. Plus a fresh node, untouched so far, and then put a fresh neighbor of every A in all the AIs up to and including what was this A1 plus 1 up to and including this one into B plus a new one. And that's it. Well, a naive picture, pick a guy, say 0, this is A, this is B, put his first neighbor in the enumeration into here, and an extra guy. Now, have a neighbor for this guy, a neighbor for this guy, and an extra guy, so that you exhaust everything eventually. Now, put a neighbor for this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy, and another one. And that way you exhaust the entire graph because it's countable. And by construction, everyone has infinitely many neighbors in the other part. That's it. It's exact matter. Okay. Okay, so that's the other extreme. If all the degrees are infinite in the countable case. Again, you can like make it slightly better. Also with finitely many exceptions, meaning if every degree is infinite except for finitely many bad guys, then do the cut for them and repeat this construction. So the interesting case has to be the mixed case. There has to be infinitely many vertices of finite degree, and there has to be infinitely many vertices of infinite degree. Otherwise, you're done. And the remaining, let's say almost 10, and the remaining 2 or 3 cases are these. This one is from Diestel, I believe. Oh yeah, this is by Diestel in 2009, and it says I'll only show it for countable graphs. Every countable railless graph has an unfriendly partition. Does everyone know what railless is? I'm naively assuming everyone here except me is a graph theorist.
I know.
Me too. Hi. So array is an infinite a path that starts somewhere and doesn't have an end in one direction. In a tree, that would be a branch. If the graph is not necessarily a tree, that's called a ray. So rayless means no rays. I'll only show it in the countable case, but the idea is similar. You just have to be more careful. By the way, I entirely skipped the most interesting part. Well, how does he do it? Well, uniform ultra filters on Amiga, of course. So we're not gonna do it here. Okay, so what's the proof here? What's interesting about this proof is the technique. It comes from an idea by Schmidt in the 80s, 83, I think, because you can characterize the class of rayless graphs as follows. Let's say F0 be the class of finite graphs. And if you already have, say, F alpha for some ordinal, or up to and not including F alpha, then do this. The idea is this: you can compose from these like simpler graphs, compose them, take them as components of a more complicated graph in whichever way, and add an extra finite set of nodes. So let if we're having let's say F beta for all beta below alpha. So let F alpha be the graphs that look like this, which have a finite set, a witness, a finite, let's say U, a subset of the vertices, such that all the components of the rest are in the previous classes. Which is to say, the graphs in F alpha are just discrete disjoint sums of simple graphs. Naive example, naive picture again. These are in the previous F betas. So these are my components. They are graphs themselves. And I have an extra set U, which is finite, which is connected in whichever way, like 2 neighbors here, no neighbors here, like 17 here, whatever, infinitely many if I start with finite here. And that's it. Except for these finitely many, they are components of lower classes. So that's an inductive construction of a class of graphs. Now, class of graphs. Now the fact is this: if you put, let's say, f bar, the union of all these classes over all ordinals, then if you start with the finite graphs, f bar, it's called a closure, is the rayless graphs. This is an analysis of the structure of the class of rayless graphs. Every graph, if and only if it is rayless, will fall into one of these alphas. One direction is trivial. Of course, if there's no rays here, that you will not create an infinite ray by adding finitely many guys. It very much resembles the counter-Bendixson when you throw away the isolated points, etc. If you are a rayless graph, that you will have a rank. You will have a rank. When did this happen to you? How complex are you if you are rayless? You will come at a certain point. Yes?
I'm just trying to imagine. Simplest. I want to. I don't see why it have to be a rayless. So if I start with f0, just a single point, nothing. Right? One graph with a single point.
Okay. Then let's say f0 is this, right?
And then
well, who's in f1 then, right?
And I will only add one. I want a graph.
Well, this is the most complex thing that will fall into f1 is a finite subset, a finite set. This is the U, and all the components of the previous of the components of the rest will look like someone in f0. So this will be these isolated points. These are graphs in f0. There's only this one, and extra finitely many extra points connected in whichever way to the previous.
Yeah. So I mean, I would just take one and one. I always add just one point for the construction. So I will keep one from before, yes, and I add one point, yes, and I keep adding this point. So am I getting an array or not? No. All right.
You know just this in this construction.
Oh, I see.
These are just the finite. I think if you don't have an array, then adding extra finitely many points will not create an array, right? So this is the point of the proof. It's an analysis of how rayless graphs look like. So, and then, well, given that, of course, I skip a bit of detail here, but having that, you prove this theorem by induction on that rank. Because that's probably a proof that I will do, because it's just elementary in graph theoretic terms. There's no set theory there. So proof by induction. By induction on the rank, that's what Schmidt calls it, on the rank of the graph, which is in some level of this stratification. So assume, so let U be finite, like the witnessing set, and the components, let's say CK of the rest be in some of the previous betas. So they already do have an unfriendly partition. How do I create an unfriendly partition for this? We'll split up the witnessing finite set U into three pieces, because there's three things that can happen to a guy in the extra set U. Namely, it is of finite degree, or it is of infinite degree, but only has finitely many neighbors in each of the other components, or it has infinitely many neighbors in one of the components. These three cases cover everything. So put U0 be the nodes in U that the degree is finite, that U1 be those, or maybe the other way around, those have infinitely many neighbors in some component, let's say ck of the remainder, and U2 be those which have only finite of infinite degree, but finitely many neighbors in each of the other components. So what do you do now? Well, here's a nice picture. These are the C1, C2, CK. These are the components of the rest. And here's the finite set U, somehow connected to the components in three possible ways for everyone. Okay, so put, let's say, Gn be the graph on the induced subgraph on the set U plus C1 and C2 up to and including CK. So it's a growing chain of subgraphs. Now, this is G1. This has an unfriendly partition. So every GK has an unfriendly partition because it is a graph of some previous class, or let's call it something, let's say PK, and this unfriendly partition induces an unfriendly partition of U. That's easy lemma. I should have stated at the beginning, an unfriendly partition of graph is an unfriendly partition on every subgraph. So, which induces an unfriendly partition on U. Okay, but U is finite, so it has finitely many partitions altogether. So these partitions PK, one of them has to keep repeating infinitely many often. So pick a partition, let's say an unfriendly partition, let's say PU of U, induced by infinitely many of these PK. Or let's say Pn, and I'll call that n, sorry, so Pn, say n1, n2, etc., nk plus 1. Right? And from this out, this is a chain of like partial unfriendly partitions, unfriendly partition on bigger and bigger and bigger subset. This chain will give me an unfriendly partition of the whole thing because I can assume that n1 is large enough to contain all the neighbors of all the guys in here, because it's finitely many of them and each of them has finitely many neighbors. So make n1 big enough, or just start later, doesn't matter. So that all neighbors of all the vertices in U0 are in the first graph, and make the steps large enough, say nk large enough, so that each guy in here, every U in U2, those are the guys which are of infinite degree, but only have, let's say this is the guy. There's 7 neighbors here, 3 here, nobody here, somebody here. Only finitely many in each CK. So make sure that he has more neighbors in this subgraph, nk plus 1 minus gnk, than in gnk. This can be done because if not, up to here, he only has 100 neighbors in these guys. So skip some of the indexes so that you gather like more than 100 in the next step. That must happen because the guy is of infinite degree and only finitely many neighbors have been consumed up to here. So take the next index to be big enough. And there's finitely many guys to take care of, so do that finitely many times. And then I will stop with the definition, of course. Then put, let's say, P of V, that's the eventual unfriendly partition. Let that be the I and K of V for every V in this subgraph. Because by doing that, you eventually exhaust everything. So every node here, that's the V, he came in at this index. Well, that's what I did for this graph. That's the pi and K. And that's it. Now you have to verify this is unfriendly, but that's straightforward verification. It is unfriendly towards the U guys, and it is unfriendly towards these guys and these guys and these guys. That's just straightforward verification from now on. So that's it. The main point of the proof, I think, is this. You can do it for other classes, but I don't know much about that. You can start with other classes or graphs. That's the F0. And what is the F bar then, the closure? Well, this is the only example I know. If you start with finite, you'll get trailers. Well, there's other cases of that. That's the point of this proof, that you do this. How much time I got? Not much. Okay. Okay, so let me state the last. Let me state the last theorem. And mind you, that is all that is known. That's from 2014, so relatively new. Theorem Eliberger, Haifa, I think, Israel, 2014. If G has no subdivision. Do people know subdivisions? Subdivision is when you can add extra nodes by splitting edges. Let's say this was in your original graph, and you are allowed to put an extra node here and connect him in these two ways. That's a subdivision. You can do that with every edge. That's a subdivision. So if there is no subdivision of the infinite clique, that's a complete graph, uncountably many. So if that's not there and no division either, then there is an unfriendly partition. Then G has an unfriendly partition.
The first line reads as G is nowhere dense, right? I mean, it's like the some or some has an
You could,
or
if there is an appropriate topology introduced to that.
nowhere dense in sense of graph theory.
I don't know what that is. I
Yeah,
don't know.
this is Shelah and others, right? I'm not the graph theorist, so I don't know really. But there are people like, yeah, there's this AA paper, I forgot the name of Adler. So they extended it to infinite graphs, I think, and that's what they would call.
Nowhere dense.
Oh, well, they use a different word, but they take
Sparse. Isn't that a sparse
no,
definition?
no. Nowhere dense is like it's like the top of the line of sparseness. So it's like the most sparse can be for a class of structures.
Okay.
And then they, yeah, this is something I've seen when you talk about infinite graphs, and we sort of like derive the notion for classes of finite graphs for an infinite object, and that would be something like that.
So it is possible. It's not all that is known. It's possible there's a
to
truth.
say more. So whatever that is actually called, it has equivalent characterizations in terms of model theory.
And that is?
And so that would be having, so that's this NIP property you might have seen. So not, yeah, I would have to look it up. I just know the acronyms.
Okay,
So
okay.
yeah, okay. Is there something going on?
Okay, so let me get back to you then, because it seems to be a nice characterization. Okay, so as far as I know, And as far as Aurici knows in the article from last week, and as far as Wikipedia knows, this is all that is known for countable graphs. Let me finish with a note on the sizes. First of all, this is what you would call a good problem. Because this statement is elementary, you just have to know what edges and nodes are, and you can understand the problem. It's been open for decades, and the first non-trivial case, namely countable, is already hard and unsolved. So that's a good problem. One last note, the counterexamples by Shelah from the 80s are huge. So there's a question, how large or small does the counterexample have to be? For the general question, not every graph has an unfriendly partition, but the Shelah graphs are the limit cardinal after continuum. And there's a theorem which in my reading says it's already very hard and sets theoretically hard. Theorem by Alejandro Aurici. He was here in the summer at this building. And it appeared on arXiv last week. So each of the following, okay, let kappa be the least, well, the minimal cardinality of a graph, without an unfriendly partition, with all nodes of infinite degree. Then, how big is it? Well, it's possible that it's Aleph omega, but the theorem is this: then each of the following is independent of ZFC. So yes, it is hard. And the statement for the cardinalities is this: kappa is exactly Aleph omega. If you're not into infinite cardinalities, never mind, but Aleph 1 is the first uncountable, Aleph 2 is the next power, etc. This is the first singular cardinal. And the fact that this is continuum plus, plus omega, meaning this happens if continuum is below Aleph omega. So then this is the first limit cardinal after continuum. Does it have to be this big? The answer is that's independent of ZFC. It might be that the Shelah counterexample is optimal. It cannot be smaller, but it is possible that not. I know this is not a set theory seminar, so that's just a final note. It's possible that the counterexamples have to be that big, and it's possible that, for example, no examples are there. Examples for the cardinalities between. If it's uncountable but below the first singular cardinal, nobody knows. So it's widely open. Even the countable case is still widely open. Okay, I'm out of time already.
Okay, thank you, speaker. Are there any questions? Other questions?
Do you know if Shelah needed some sort of theoretical assumption?
No, it doesn't go beyond ZFC. It is he takes a uniform, non-trivial ultrafilter on omega and takes a graph on this times something, and the ultrafilter dictates the edges so that there is no unfriendly partition. It comes out of a ultrafilter. It's not definable, for example. But there's no like heavy technique beyond using ultrafilters cleverly. There's no forcing, no diamonds, nothing. ZFC with filter.
That's here. Right.
Oh, here, I forgot what the forcings are. Independent meaning it's possible that yes, it's possible that no. And the forcings, I don't know what that is. It's a weak code. I haven't read it. I only read the statement.
No, I would be surprised if there they didn't use any force.
They did, obviously.
Yeah.
They did use forcing. I don't know what the forcing notions are.
The Shelah result.
No. The Shelah result is in ZFC having ultrafilters will give you the bad graph.
Yeah.
Well, the graph is huge.
So, yeah, I'll not do it.
Homework for graph theorists, obviously. If you do the Schmidt construction and start with some traditional class of graphs, well, what do you get as the closure? I only know the one case. Starting with finite, you get rayless. What's all the other cases? I don't know.
So any other question?
Yeah.
When I like compare the number of neighbors in what the set I, set B, it's like enough. It's just one infinity and other infinity of say cardinality. Is it sufficient?
I think the cardinalities of the parts don't play a role in that. Maybe there's a side effect of how big the parts are, but as an easy example, in the finite case, I'm friends with all of you, and neither of you are friends with anyone among you. Well, I come to one bus, you come on the other bus, and I have this many friends there, nobody here, and you got me here and nobody at your bus. So it's one versus everybody else, and that's an unfriendly partition. That's a finite case, of course, but the cardinalities can be whatever, I think. It can be one node versus everybody else, for example. In the infinite case, I don't know. Maybe there's a side effect of how big the parts need to be, but I don't think that's the answer to that. The problem is the graph structure, like who's connected to who, not how many there are.
So I will make like in the infinite sense, be like we can say half. So instead of that, like what is the?
Oh, that's a good question. What do we mean by as many as in terms of cardinality, of course. So in the countable case, you've got infinitely many friends there. If you've got infinitely many here, in the finite case, it means number size. But you can still say as many as. Just use infinite cardinals. Yep.
Okay, one last question, and the other question will be answered individually.
Yeah, so the constructing the F bar you had, yeah, that looks like when you're constructing the radar graph a little bit.
Yes.
Is there some connection?
I haven't looked into that, but it looks very much as a categorical limit in some sense. This is not for one structure. That was what they call an age of a structure. You look at the finite substructures and then build up the random order and the random graph. But this is not for like one structure. That's for a class of structures. But yes, it does resemble that. Like if you're pruning a tree, you just throw away the dead branches. Now more branches become dead because there's no splitting. So you keep going. And if your graph is prunable, it will die out at some index. And if not, a perfect set will remain. It's similar to that. Or the counter Bendixson, like you are throwing away isolated points of a real set, and then other points become isolated. So you keep doing that, and either you end up with nothing, or you end up with a perfect set that has no isolated points. It's, I know, I only know this case, sorry.
So let's thank the speaker again.